The book had brass at its corners and a strap that had stopped buckling years ago, and it had lain open on the kitchen table at Fold Farm every evening for 11 winters. Thomas Craddock bought it in Leominster the month they were married, because a man with land under him ought to own a book. He wrote in it perhaps 20 times in his life. His wife wrote in it every night, in a hand so small and even that the pages looked ruled twice over. Agnes Craddock had a way of sitting to it that her neighbours would have called stubborn if they had thought about it at all. She did not lean. She set the candle to her left so the shadow of her hand fell away from the page, and she worked down the column the way another woman works down a row of beans. Barley sold. Cheese sold. 2 pigs were killed, and the flitches salted. A shilling to the smith for the coulter. The figures never lied to her, and she had come to prefer them for that. That February, the meadow under Cleve was still standing in water. It had stood in water since Candlemas, and the drain that ought to have carried it away had been choked 2 summers running, and Agnes had written 3 times to the estate office about it, in a hand any clerk could read. She kept the copies of all 3 letters folded inside the back cover of the book, because a woman alone learns young to keep the copy. Thomas had been dead a year and 2 months, of a chest that would not clear. He had told her from the pillow to sell the ewes before Lady Day. She sold the cart horse instead, and kept the flock, and the flock lambed well, and by any reckoning she had done better in her widowhood than her husband had done in his prime. Nobody in the parish said so aloud. There is a kind of quiet a woman earns by being right where she is not supposed to be doing the arithmetic at all. Her son was 10 years old and named Jem for his grandfather, and he had his father's shoulders coming and his mother's stillness. He could not sit at a book for a quarter of an hour without his knee beginning to jump, and Agnes had long ago decided this was no fault in him, only a difference, and she taught him at the byre door instead of the table. The notice went up on the tithe barn on the 2nd Sunday in Lent, written in a fine copper plate that curled at the capitals and pinned with 4 nails, 1 at each corner. Agnes read it while the bell was still going. New terms of tenancy. All arrears to be cleared before the feast of St. John. All tenancies at will to be reviewed. All repairs henceforward the charge of the tenant, saving only the roofs of the great barns. She read it twice and did the sum standing there, without paper. Fold Farm carried arrears of £9 and 11 shillings, of which 7 had been laid against her in the year of the flood, when the meadow drowned because of a drain that was not hers to dig. Cleared before the feast of St. John meant cleared before the hay was in, which meant cleared out of nothing at all. They will have half the fold out by harvest, came from behind her, and old Ruth Padmore put a hand on the notice as if to feel whether it were warm. Widows first. Widows are always first. Agnes did not answer that, because it was true, and because saying so would only fix it harder in the old woman's chest. She walked home along the ridge with the wet coming through her boots, and the rooks going up out of the Havermere oaks in a long ragged thread, thinking that the estate was being managed by a man who had never once walked the ground he was writing about. His name was Ferriby. He had come 3 years before out of Bristol, when old Mr. Rowe grew too shaky to ride, and he had the manner of a man who has learned exactly how much civility a thing requires, and gives not 1 grain over. Tenants came on quarter days and stood while he sat, and he had a way of turning the ledger so that they could not see it, which Agnes had noticed the first time and never stopped noticing. The court itself had been shut for 4 years. The old Duke had died at Naples of a fever that took him in 9 days, and the title had gone sideways to a younger brother nobody in the county knew. A soldier who had been in Spain, and then in India, and then nowhere in particular. The shutters stayed closed. The gardens went to seed in a slow, orderly way, and the great house sat above the parish like a face that has stopped listening. Lady Day came, and Agnes carried her rent up the drive in a leather bag that had been her husband's, held against her ribs because it was raining, and she did not choose to arrive with the money wet. She paid what she could and asked again for the arrears of the flood year to be looked at. Ferriby did not look up from his pen. The arrears stand as entered. They were entered wrong. They were entered by me. Then they were entered wrong by you. She set the bag on the edge of his desk and did not take her hand off it. The £7 was laid as loss of crop. There was no crop to lose. The ground was under water from the first week of April. You cannot charge a tenant for the value of hay that never grew on a meadow the estate would not drain. He wrote 3 more words before he answered, which she understood was meant to teach her something about the size of her own importance. You have been reading, Mrs. Craddock. I have been keeping accounts since I was 19 years old. Farm accounts. He set the pen down at last and gave her the whole of his attention, which was worse than the pen. There is a difference between a woman's tally of eggs and the management of 11,000 acres, and it does you no credit to pretend otherwise. Your money, if you please. There are others waiting. There were others waiting. That was the thing he had counted on, and it worked, because Agnes Craddock had learned that a woman who makes a scene in front of her neighbours pays for it 3 times over and never once in coin. She stood while he counted the money, and she watched the pen go along the line, and she saw, without any effort at all, that he wrote the figure into the arrears column and not the rent column. She said nothing about it in the room. She said it in a letter that night, in her small even hand, and she kept the copy. In April the shutters came off Havermere Court, and the sound of the bolts going back carried all the way down to the fold, and by the second evening 3 chimneys were smoking that had not smoked since the old Duke's funeral. On the Friday a travelling carriage came up the avenue with a rough grey lurcher trotting loose at the wheel, and Nicholas Ormery, 7th Duke of Havermere, came home to a house he had been inside perhaps 4 times in his life. The parish got its look at him at church on the Sunday. 8:30, dark, thin through the face, and he came up the aisle at a pace that made his aunt take 2 steps to his 1. He did not use the prayer book. His eyes went over the congregation and the windows and the monument to his brother without settling on any of them, and afterwards Ruth Padmore called him proud, and the miller called him cold, and the schoolmaster said soldiers looked through you as a habit of trade. Agnes said nothing at all. But she had been at the end of the pew nearest the aisle, and she had seen him put his hand very lightly on the corner of the box pew as he turned into it. Not leaning. Only touching. The way you touch a door frame in a room you know is dark. The audit was called for the first week of May, in a way the parish had not seen in 20 years, every tenant by name, in order of the acreage, at the estate office on 3 consecutive days. Ferriby set the notices himself. Agnes was given the Thursday at 3:30, which is the hour a man chooses when he wants a business finished and forgotten before dinner. She went up early, by the path along the walled garden rather than the drive, because the drive meant the front of the house and she had no business at the front of it. The east range gave on to a cobbled yard with a mounting block and a pump, and there were 2 men standing in it with their backs to her when she came round the corner of the laundry, and one of them was Ferriby, and the other was the Duke. She stopped. To walk on would have meant crossing directly between them, and she had a bag of papers under her arm and half an hour in hand, and so she stayed where she was in the shadow of the laundry wall, meaning to wait until they had gone in. 16 of them will clear, Ferriby was saying. 9 will not. Of the 9, 5 are old men with no sons, and the ground is going back to rush under them. I would advise consolidation. Throw the 5 into 2 holdings and let them to Padmore and to Yeatman, who have the capital. And the other 4, 2 are drunkards, your grace. 1 is a fool, and 1 is a woman. There was a sound of a horse being led out somewhere behind the arch, and Agnes lost a phrase, and then Ferriby's voice came back with a little laugh in it that she had never heard him use with a tenant. Fold Farm. Craddock's widow. She writes me letters, your grace. letters upon letters. She has some notion that she has found an error in the accounts, and I have had to explain to her, more than once, that the estate books are not a matter of eggs and butter. It is a kindness to be plain with these people. There is no cruelty like letting a woman believe she can hold a farm. And the Duke, who had not turned round, who was standing with one hand on the neck of the grey lurcher and his face towards the arch and the light, answered in a flat and weary voice, the voice of a man agreeing to something in order to have done with it. She cannot read a ledger, let alone run one. Do what is right by her. Find her a cottage. Agnes stood very still. There is a particular stillness that comes when a thing has been said about you by a person who does not know you are there, and it is not rage. It is a sort of cold clarity, as though someone had taken the glass out of a window you had been looking through for years. She could have walked out into the yard. She thought about it for the length of 2 breaths. Instead, she went back the way she had come and round to the drive, and she stood at the front of the house like a person with business there until the church clock struck the half-hour, and then she went in at the office door and gave her name to the clerk and sat down to be audited. Ferriby did not mention the cottage. He went through the columns and turned the book away from her, and asked her whether she understood the position, and Agnes answered every question he put and volunteered nothing, and when it was done she stood up and set a folded paper on the desk. That is a copy of your entry for Lady Day, and a copy of the receipt you gave me, and they do not agree. It is not a large sum. It is £1 and 4 shillings. I would be obliged if you would look at it. I have looked at a great deal today. Then look at it tomorrow. She put on her gloves without hurrying. I will not write again. I have written 4 times. But I shall keep the copies, Mr. Ferriby, and I shall keep them for as long as I am in this parish, and if the day comes that anyone wishes to see them, they will be in order. He looked up at that. It was the first time in 3 years that he had properly looked at her, and what came into his face was not anger. It was calculation, and it went across him quickly and was gone. And Agnes understood that she had just made an enemy of a man who had until that afternoon merely despised her. The notice to quit Fold Farm was not served in May. She turned that over for a fortnight and could make nothing of it. What came instead, on the last Saturday of the month, was a boy from the court with a note asking whether Mrs. Craddock of Fold would wait upon his Grace at 7 on Monday evening, on a matter of business. Jem read it over her shoulder and asked whether they were to be turned out, and Agnes folded the note twice and put it on the mantel behind the tea-caddy. If we are to be turned out, we shall know it by daylight and not by candle. Fetch the ewes in off the ridge. She went up on the Monday in her good dress, which was black and 4 years old, and she was taken not to the office, but through the house, and up a half-stair into a library where the last of the light was coming in green off the beeches. The grey lurcher was lying in front of the fire, and when she came in it, got up and crossed the room and put its head against her hip and stayed there, which is a thing dogs do without any reason that can be written down. Wynne, the Duke of Havermere, observed from the window. He has decided, then, he does not do it often, and I have never known him wrong. Agnes put her hand on the dog's skull. Your Grace wished to see me on a matter of business. I did. He came away from the window and stopped at the end of the long table, where a great many papers were spread out in no order that she could see, and he stood with the tips of his fingers on the wood. You were in the laundry yard on the first Thursday of the month. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. I was. You heard what I said to Ferriby. I did. And you came into that office half an hour later and sat down and answered his questions, and never gave the smallest sign. He was quiet for a moment. I have had men under me who could not have done that. There would have been no profit in doing anything else. No, he turned one of the papers over with 2 fingers and turned it back. I am told you keep accounts. I keep my own. Ferriby tells me they are the accounts of a henwife with an inflated notion of herself. He is a fluent man, and I have been listening to him for 6 weeks, chiefly because I have not been in a position to do anything else. It came out evenly, without apology, and then he did something she did not expect at all. He pushed a single sheet of paper down the length of the table, so that it came to rest under her hand. Read that aloud to me, if you will. It was a bill from a timber merchant at Bromyard. Agnes read it through once with her eyes before she read it with her voice, which was habit, and then she read it out plainly. The date, the quantity, the price, the carriage, the name of the carrier, the total. Again, she read it again. When she had finished the second time, she laid it down and said, in the same voice she had used for the figures, "The carriage is wrong. He did not move." Go on. It is charged at the rate for Ludlow. Bromyard is 9 miles nearer by the turnpike, and the estate has never paid the Ludlow rate for Bromyard timber in the 11 years I have been looking at what the estate pays for things. It is a difference of some 18 shillings on this one bill. It is nothing at all on one bill. And on 40. On 40 it is a labourer's wage for a year. She looked up. I would not swear to it on my Bible from one sheet of paper. I would want the others. The fire settled. The dog sighed and put its chin down on her foot, and the Duke of Havermere came round the end of the table and stood where the light from the window fell across the papers, and Agnes saw him do a thing she had seen her own husband's father do at the last. He turned his head very slightly to one side, so as to bring the page into the edge of his vision rather than the middle of it. "You know," he remarked, "I imagine you have already worked it out. I would rather your Grace told me than that I guessed. That is a courtesy, and we both know what it costs you." He picked the sheet up, held it at the length of his arm, and set it down again. "There is a grey place in the middle of everything I look at. It came on in Madras 4 years ago, and it has been growing since. I can see the shape of you, and the light behind you, and whether you have moved. I cannot see your face. What I have not been able to do for 2 years and a half is read one written word without a glass, and for the last 8 months I have not been able to do it with one." Agnes said nothing for a moment. It seemed to her that the wrong thing said here would be worse than a slap. 4 physicians in London, he went on, and 1 in Paris, and a Scotchman in Bath who wanted to put leeches on my temples. They agree upon nothing except the word gradual. My aunt does not know. My agent does not know. And now you know. Which means the only person in this county with the whole of it is a widow I ordered turned out of her farm, because a fluent man told me she was a fool, and I was too tired to ask a second question. Your Grace never ordered me turned out. You said find her a cottage. Do not do that. It came out sharply. Do not manage me. I have been managed for 6 weeks by an expert, and I did not care for the taste of it once I noticed. Very well. She folded her hands. Then I shall say what I think, and your Grace may find it worse. You did not say a foolish thing because you were tired. You said it because it was easy. It is the easiest sentence in England, and every man in this parish has said some version of it to some woman, and most of them were tired at the time. The room was very quiet. Wynne lifted his head, looked between them, and put it down again. Yes, the Duke of Havermere agreed at last. That is fair. That is entirely fair, and I would be obliged if you would sit down, Mrs. Craddock, because what I want to ask you will take some time, and I find I am not enjoying standing up to it. The arrangement they made that evening was small and exact, and neither of them called it anything. Twice a week, at 7, Agnes would come up to the library through the garden door and read to him. The post first, then whatever papers he set out. She would say what she thought of the figures, and she would say nothing outside the room. of the figures or of the grey place in the middle of everything he looked at, to any living soul. He offered her £30 a year. She refused it, which visibly annoyed him, and then she named what she wanted instead, and he stopped being annoyed. The drain under Cleve. It carries the water off 4 holdings and not only mine, and it has been choked since before your grace came home. It wants 3 men for a fortnight and a load of stone. I have costed it. It comes to £11 and some shillings, and it will put 9 acres of meadow back into hay for 4 families for the next 40 years. That is not payment. That is a public work. It is payment to me. She stood and shook out her skirt. I have written about that drain 3 times and been laughed at once in front of my neighbours. If it is dug because I asked for it, then I am not a henwife, and every man at the fold will know I am not, and that is worth a great deal more to me than £30 a year, which I could not explain to anybody without explaining the rest. He was silent for a moment. Then he inclined his head once, the way a man does at the end of a piece of business with somebody he has decided to respect. The drain was dug in the 2nd week of June, so the summer arranged itself around 2 evenings. She came up through the garden door at 7, with her boots changed at the scullery and her own book under her arm, because she would not use the estate's paper. He never sat. He walked from the window to the fireplace and back, and it took her 3 weeks to understand that a man who is being read to and cannot see the reader must do something with his body or go mad. She read the post. Letters from a bank in the Strand, from a cousin in Ireland, from a widow in Portsmouth, whose husband had died under his command, and who wanted nothing except to say so. He dictated the answers, and Agnes wrote them, and after the first fortnight he began simply to tell her what he meant, and let her put it into words, and then to argue with the words she chose, and then, by July, to stop arguing. She read the ledgers. That was the slow part, and it was the part she loved, though she would not have used the word. A great estate on paper is a kind of weather. Hop poles come in the spring and lime in the autumn, wages rise in the 6 weeks of harvest and fall away, cider is sold in the winter, and any man who wants to hide something in it must hide it in the season where it belongs, or accept that it will sit in the column like a rook on a white field. Agnes had been reading her own weather for 11 years. It took her until the last week of June to be certain of the Duke of Havermere's. "Say it," he told her, at the window with the light going. "I would rather show your grace the paper, and I cannot, and that is the difficulty we shall keep having." She squared the ledger with the edge of the table, uselessly, out of habit. "There are 3 things. The first is the carriage rates, which run through 4 years and come to something over £200. The second is repairs. There are 19 entries in 3 years for work on the cider mill at Nether Havermere, and I have walked past that mill twice a week my whole married life. It has had 1 new door. And the third is wages." She kept her voice quite level. "In the harvest month you pay a great many casual men, and they are entered by name. In the harvest of the year before last there are 11 names I do not know, and I know everybody who has ever swung a hook in this parish. They are always paid in a lump, and always signed for by the same hand, and it is the same hand for all 11, and it is a very good hand. It curls at the capitals." He was standing with his back to the room. The rooks were going up out of the beeches in a long ragged thread, as they had gone up over her on the ridge in Lent. "How much? With the timber and the mill, and taking the wages only where I am sure, £460, and some odd shillings across 4 years. She closed the book. "It will be more. I am only sure of that much." The Dowager Duchess came down from London on the 7th of July with 3 carriages, a French maid, a chaplain she had acquired in Bath, and Miss Amelia Prouse, whose father had 11 ships out of Bristol and no sons at all. Agnes heard about it at the mill before she heard about it from the house. The parish knew the shape of the great family's intentions the way it knew the weather, by the feel of the air, and the feel of the air that week was of a match being made. Miss Prowse was 22 and pretty in the way that money makes a woman pretty, which is to say well rested. She rode out with the Duke twice that week, and the Dowager gave orders that the great dining room was to be got ready for the Lammas dinner. That Thursday there was no reading. A note came down instead, in a servant's hand. The following Monday there was, but it was at 9 at night and not 7, and Agnes came up through the garden in the last of the light with the sense for the first time of doing something that would look like something else if anybody saw it. Somebody saw it. It is a small parish. By the end of the week Jem came home from the schoolmaster's with a torn collar and a closed face, and would not say what for, and Agnes did not ask, and at midnight she stood in the kitchen with her hands on the back of a chair for a long while. It was Ferriby's doing. A man who wants a thing said in a village does not say it himself, he says it to a groom, and by Sunday it is a fact so old that nobody can remember where it came from. What was said was not even coarse, which was the cleverness of it, only that Mrs. Craddock of Fold was up at the house a good deal, and that she had got her drain dug when better men had waited 9 years for a gate. The Duke of Havermere heard none of it, because dukes never do. What he heard was his aunt, on the terrace, on the second Sunday in July, with her fan going. I am told there is a woman. There are several hundred women in this parish, ma'am. It is a populous county. Do not be tiresome, Nicholas, a tenant's widow who comes to the house after dark and leaves before the servants are up, and whose rent, I am given to understand, is a matter of some accommodation. The fan stopped. I do not care what you do. I would be obliged if you would take the trouble to do it 30 miles away, and not in the month when I am obliged to give a dinner for 24 people, one of whom has 11 ships. He might have ended it there. He had commanded men in 2 countries and knew precisely the tone that finishes a conversation, and what he did instead. Because he was tired and because he had spent the morning failing to read a letter from his own bank, was to say nothing at all for 3 or 4 seconds. 3 or 4 seconds is a long time on a terrace. Ah, his aunt observed. That was Sunday. On the Tuesday Ferriby asked for an interview and got it, and came into the library at 11 in the morning with a japanned box under his arm and a face of considerable sorrow. He had been at work for 3 weeks, and Agnes had been right about the shape of it and wrong about the speed. What he laid on the table was a bundle of papers concerning Fold Farm, and the case they made was this: that the arrears of the flood year had been entered at the tenant's own request, and here was a letter in her hand asking for the loss to be carried forward. That her own accounts showed a yield from the Cleve meadow in the very year she claimed it under water. That a receipt she had lately produced against the office was in a hand that was not the clerk's. I take no pleasure in it, Ferriby remarked to the window, which was where the Duke of Havermere was standing. She is a clever woman and a hard-working one. But your Grace will understand my position. She has had my books open in front of her, in this room, by candlelight, and now there is a story going about the parish that the estate is being robbed, and the person telling it is the one tenant in 11,000 acres, with a proven interest in the arrears column, and a hand that can imitate a receipt. The Duke of Havermere had been standing at that window for some time. He knew every one of those papers by the sound of them, because he had heard Agnes read out the true versions of half of them across 9 weeks, and there was not a man in the county who could have taken them off the table and shown him where the lie was. He asked one question, and it was the wrong one, and he knew it was the wrong one before it was out of his mouth. The letter. The one asking for the loss to be carried forward. In her hand. In her hand, your Grace. I would swear to it. Leave it with me. Agnes came up on the Thursday because she had said she would, and because whatever else happened, she would not be a woman who stopped coming. The garden door was unbolted. The candles were lit. The papers on the long table had been arranged, and she saw at once that they had been arranged by somebody with sight, in a neat overlapping fan, the way Ferriby laid out a case. He was at the fireplace. He did not walk that evening. "There is a letter here," the Duke of Havermere began, "which purports to be from you to the office, 3 years ago, consenting to the arrears of the flood year. There is no such letter. It is in your hand. Then it is a very good copy of my hand, and I should like to see it beside the 4 letters I did write, of which I have the copies at home, folded inside the back cover of my husband's book, where they have been since the day I wrote them." She had not raised her voice. Her hands had gone cold. "Your Grace has heard me read every one of those ledgers. You know what is in them. You know what is not. I know what I have been told is in them." It landed in the room like a dropped plate. He put his hand out immediately, half a movement, and stopped it. "Agnes, no." She stepped back 1 pace, and the dog stood up between them. "You may say it and then take it back, or you may not say it. You cannot do both and have it be nothing. 9 weeks, Your Grace. I have read you your bank and your cousin, and the letter from the woman at Portsmouth, and I have never carried a word of it down that hill, and I have not told one living soul that the Duke of Havermere cannot see the print in his own prayer book. I could have, any week since May. I know it. You do not, or you would not have hesitated." She picked up her own book from the corner of the table where it always sat. "You hesitated. I watched you do it. It took about as long as it takes to shut a door. Sit down and let me have the papers read to me properly. By whom?" She was at the garden door. "That is the whole of it, is it not? There is one woman in this county who can read your ledgers to you, and this morning a fluent man told you she was a forger, and you have spent the day unable to look at a single sheet of paper to find out. I am sorry for you. But I will not stand in this room and be doubted by a man I have been the eyes of since Whitsoon. The notice to quit Fold Farm was served on the following Monday over Ferriby's signature to take effect at Michaelmas. There is a thing that happens in a parish when a notice goes up, and it is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. People who have been kind to you go on being kind at a slight distance, because they have their own tenancies at will and their own arrears, and everybody understands which way the wind has set. Ruth Padmore came and brought eggs and cried in the kitchen, and Agnes made her tea and comforted her, which is generally how such visits go. The schoolmaster offered to write to the Duke, and Agnes told him not to, because a letter from a man who cannot afford to lose his place is a gift too expensive to accept. Nobody else came. She did what there was to do. She went through the house and made a list of what was hers and what had come with the tenancy, and she was scrupulous about it, in a way that would have made a stranger think her slow. Thomas's tools went into the yard on the Saturday, and the smith bought the anvil, and a man from Bodenham bought the plough, and asked, standing with his hat in his hands, whether she had anywhere to go. "My sister has a house at Wearbley," Agnes told him. "She has a room." She did not tell him that her sister had 4 children in 3 rooms and a husband who drank. That was not his to carry. Jem stopped asking about it after the first week. He took to going out at first light and coming back at dark, and one evening she found him sitting on the wall above the Cleve meadow, looking at the drain, which was running clear and had been running clear all summer, and the 9 acres below it standing in a good thick aftermath the colour of a cat's back. "They will get the hay off that," he remarked when she sat down beside him. "Padmore will." "Yes, you dug it. I asked for it." "That is a different thing, and it is the only thing I had to give." She put her arm round him, which he permitted, being tired. "You will hear people say your mother got above herself. Some of them will say it kindly. When you hear it, remember one fact, and do not argue about it, because arguing only spreads it. That meadow is dry. Whatever else, that meadow is dry, and it will be dry when you are an old man, That night, after he was asleep, she sat down at the kitchen table with her husband's book open in front of her and the brass corners catching the candle, and she did the last piece of work she would ever do for the Duke of Havermere. It took her 4 nights. She copied out, in her small even hand, on 9 sheets of paper, every entry she had found across 4 years and could stand behind. The timber carriage, bill by bill, with the rate and the true rate and the difference. The 11 names in the harvest book, and the note quite plain that all 11 signatures were in one hand, and that the hand curled at the capitals. Beside the total she set down what she could swear to and what she could not, and she was harder on herself than any court would have been, and struck out £90. She sent no covering letter. There was nothing to say in one that would not either beg or accuse, and she would not do either. She folded the 9 sheets and tied them with thread, and on the Wednesday morning she gave the packet to the carrier's boy and told him to leave it at the estate office with the Duke's name on it, and to put it into the hand of a footman and not a clerk. Then she went out and mended the gate on the top ground, which was not hers to mend, and would not be hers at Michaelmas, because it was hanging, and it was August, and there were sheep behind it. The packet came to the library at 11 in the morning. He knew what it was the moment he had it in his hands, because nobody else in England would have tied papers with thread. He carried it to the window out of pure animal habit, and held it in the light and turned it, and the writing lay on the page as a soft grey field, with a hole in the middle where his sight used to be. He stood there for a long time. The Dowager Duchess found him there at 11:30, and began upon the question of the dinner and the ordering of the table, and got 2 sentences into it before he turned round. "Ma'am, I want you to read something to me. Ring for your man." No, he came away from the window and put the papers into her hands, and then, because there was no version of the next part that could be done gently, he put it plainly. "I cannot read it. I have not been able to read anything for 2 years and a half. There is a grey place in the middle of my sight, and it is growing, and there is nothing to be done about it, and I have told nobody in this family. That is why Ferriby has had the running of 11,000 acres, and why I need you to sit down and read me 9 sheets of paper in a woman's hand, and not stop, and not ask me anything until you have finished." She sat down. She read the 9 sheets from beginning to end in a steady voice that only faltered once, near the bottom of the 7th, and when she had finished, she squared them on her knee and looked at her nephew for some while. "This is the widow. Yes, you had her notice served. Ferriby had it served. I did not stop it." He was standing with one hand on the back of a chair, which is the same thing, and I shall not be pretending otherwise, to you or to anybody. "No." The old woman looked down at the papers again. "Nicholas, I have sat at that dinner table for 50 years and listened to men explain estates to me. So understand what I am telling you. Whoever wrote this is not clever. Clever is common. This is careful, which is not. She has taken £90 out of her own case because she could not prove it, and there is not one man in this county who would have done that with an enemy in front of him. They sent for the harvest book, and the mill accounts, and 4 years of timber bills, and the Dowager Duchess of Havermere read aloud in the library from noon until nearly 7, with a footman fetching candles, and by the end of it they had the whole of it, and rather more than Agnes had claimed. Ferriby was sent for at 9 the next morning. He came in with a japanned box, because he was a man of habit, and he began well. He was fluent for perhaps 4 minutes. The Duke of Havermere let him finish. Then he asked him to explain the carriage rate on the Bromyard timber, and the 19 doors of Nether Havermere Mill, and to name any 3 of the 11 men who had cut wheat on the home farm last harvest, and signed for their money in a hand that curled at the capitals. There was a long silence in the estate office. "Your Grace has been talking to that woman." "I have been listening to her since May, which is a different thing and a good deal rarer. He put out his hand. "The keys, Mr. Ferriby. Your Grace cannot dismiss me upon the word of a tenant's widow with a grievance and no witnesses. I am not dismissing you upon her word. I am dismissing you upon your own books, which my aunt has read to me from end to end, and which went into the strong room of my bank at Hereford last evening in a locked box." He kept his hand out. "You may go quietly, and I shall not prosecute. Because a prosecution would drag 40 tenants into a court at Hereford and shame this parish, and I have done enough to this parish for one summer. Or you may argue. The keys. They came off the ring one at a time, which took longer than either of them expected, and made a small flat sound each time on the desk. He came down to Fold Farm at 6 the next morning, alone, on a big raw-boned bay, with the lurcher running loose at the stirrup. It was the last week of July, and the light was already hard on the stubble of the top ground, and Jem was at the gate with a bucket in each hand and set them both down and stood there. "Is my mother to be turned out?" "No, you had the paper served. I did not stop it being served, which is the same thing, and I shall be saying so to your mother in about 1 minute, and I would rather say it to her first." The Duke of Havermere got down off the bay, which took him a moment longer than it should have, because a man who cannot judge the ground must find it with his foot. "What is your name?" "Jem Craddock. Hold his head, Jem Craddock, and do not let him at the hedge." "He eats hedges." Agnes came out with her sleeves pushed up and flour to the wrist, because it was baking day and the world does not stop for anybody, and she stood in the doorway and did not come down the step. He had the 9 sheets in his hand, tied with her thread, and the notice to quit folded on top of them. "Ferriby is gone. He went at 9:30 yesterday morning, and his keys are in my desk, and the whole of his business went to my bank at Hereford on Tuesday evening in a locked box. My aunt read your 9 sheets to me on Monday, from noon until 7, and she has been in the estate office since 6 this morning, with a pen and a great deal of satisfaction." He held out the notice. "This is yours. Burn it or keep it, and if you keep it I shall not blame you." She did not take it. "Why did your Grace ride down here instead of sending it?" "Because a note would have been the coward's version, and you would have known it." He lowered his hand. "Mrs. Craddock, I am not going to tell you that I never doubted you. You were standing in front of me when I did it, and you had the goodness to name it out loud. I doubted you for about as long as it takes to shut a door, and if we begin by pretending that did not happen, then everything after it is built on a lie, and I have had a summer of those." The dog had come up the step past her and gone into the kitchen as though it lived there. "What comes after it?" Agnes repeated. "I am asking you to take the estate." She stood quite still, with the flower on her arms. "Not the office. Ferriby's office was a room with the ledger turned away from the tenant, and I am having that desk taken out and burnt. I mean the stewardship of 11,000 acres, the whole of it, at £120 a year, your name in the estate book, the keys of the counting-house and the strong room on your ring, and nobody else's." He paused. My aunt suggested the figure. I had said 80. She observed that 80 was what I would offer a woman, and 120 what I would offer a man from Bristol with a good coat. It was a long moment before Agnes answered, and when she did it was not the answer he had prepared for. "No." "Why?" "Because of what they will say." She came down the step and looked away down the fold to where the drain ran clear under the cleave. "I have had 9 weeks of it already, and I have watched my son come home with his collar torn and not tell me why. If you put me behind that desk quietly, with a note in the church porch, every soul in this parish will have decided by Michaelmas what I did to get it, and they will not say it to my face. They will say it to Jem. They will half believe it for 20 years, and I would be no good to you. Then it will not be quiet." She looked round at him. "Lammas is on Saturday. The The Duke of Havermere went on. There has been no Lammas gathering at Havermere since my brother went abroad. Every tenant on this estate will be in that barn, and the vicar and the miller, and every man who ever stood in that yard. He turned his head very slightly, in the way she knew, to bring her into the edge of his sight. I will do it there, with the doors open. Tell me your terms now, and I will agree to them out loud in front of them, so that there is no version left for the tap room to invent. Agnes Craddock had thought about her terms. She had thought about them at 2:00 in the morning for a fortnight, in the way of a woman who does not expect to be asked, and cannot stop drawing up the answer anyway. 7-year leases for every tenancy at will on this estate, and the rents fixed for the 7 years. Done. The arrears of the flood year struck across all 4 holdings under Cleve, and not only mine, and struck for the reason that the estate did not dig the drain, and that reason said aloud, done. Wages entered by name, and paid at the barn into the hand of the man who cut, and no lump sums and no signing for another man ever again on this ground. Done, my son at the school until he is 15, and the fee out of my own wages and not your Grace's kindness. And I shall want that said too. Done, and I think that is a foolish piece of pride, and I have no standing whatever to say so. There is one more. She had come to the head of the bay, and she put her hand on the horse's neck, and Jem, who had gone very quiet, was watching his mother the way a boy watches a thing he will remember at 70. You must tell them about your eyes. The Duke of Havermere did not answer. I have kept it since May and I would keep it until I died, and that is exactly why it cannot be kept. The woman goes up to the great house twice a week after dark, and one day she has the keys of the strong room. There is no honest story in that shape. There is only the one they will make up. Her hand moved once down the horse's neck. But if they know that a tenant's widow has been reading the rent roll to a master who cannot see it, there is nothing left to whisper. It becomes a fact about the estate, like the drain. And men do not gossip about drains. You are asking me to stand up in front of 400 people and say that I am going blind. I am asking you to hand me the keys with clean hands. She met the place where his eyes were. Your Grace has carried it alone for 2 years and a half, and it has cost you £460 and a good agent you never hired, and it very nearly cost you the one person who could have told you so. Say it once, out loud, in that barn, and it will be over by Sunday, and they will be talking about the hay. The bay shifted. Down in the fold a dog was barking at something, and up at the court the first cart of the day was going over the gravel. You are a hard woman, Mrs. Craddock. I am a careful one. Your Grace's aunt said so on Monday, and she was reading my handwriting at the time. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him do it, and it was a rough, unpractised sound, the laugh of a man who has been out of the habit for years and finds the machinery still in working order. Saturday, he agreed. At noon, the 1st of August came in hot and still, with a haze standing over the Lug Valley and the wheat on the home farm gone the colour of a fox. They had been at the tithe barn since Thursday. There were boards on trestles the whole length of it, and greenery nailed along the tie beams, and the great doors were open at both ends so the air went through. The first sheaf had been cut on Friday evening, and the first loaf baked out of it that morning, and it sat on a cloth at the head of the middle table, a plain brown loaf, slightly out of shape, worth nothing whatever, and worth the whole year. They came from 10 in the morning onwards, on foot and in carts. Padmore and Yeatman and the Bodenham men, the hop tenants from the low ground, the cottagers, the mill, the smith, the schoolmaster in his one coat, the carrier's boy who had taken 9 sheets of paper up the hill and had no idea he had done anything. There were children under the tables within a quarter of an hour, and a fiddle tuning in the porch. Agnes came late, and came from the fold on foot, with Jem beside her in a collar she had turned. She wore the black dress because it was the only good one she had, having decided that a woman who borrows a dress for the occasion has already conceded something. They stood near the south door where the draught was. At noon the Duke of Havermere came in at the north end with his aunt on his arm, and the barn went down to a murmur, and he let go of her at the head of the middle table and stood by the loaf, and the murmur went out altogether. He did not use a paper. He had nothing in his hands at all. You have not had a Lammas out of this house for 5 years, and that is my family's fault and not yours, and there is beer in the porch, so I shall be short. He waited for the small laugh and got it. In May I stood in the laundry yard of my own house with my agent, and said a thing about one of you, and I want it repeated correctly, because a great many of you have heard it wrong. What I said was, she cannot read a ledger, let alone run one. I said it about Mrs. Craddock of Fold. I had never spoken to her in my life. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the barn a child was hushed. She heard me say it from behind the laundry wall, and she came into my office half an hour after and paid her rent and never gave a sign, and that is the first thing I know about her character, and I have never got past it. He put one hand flat on the table. The second is this. Since Whitsun, that woman has been coming to my library twice a week after dark, and this parish has had a great deal of enjoyment out of it, and I am going to spoil that now. She has been reading to me. She has been reading to me, because I am going blind. The barn made a sound. It was not a gasp, and it was not talk. It was 400 people shifting their weight at the same moment, which is a thing you feel through the boards of a floor rather than hear. It came on in India 4 years ago. There is a grey place in the middle of everything I look at, and it is getting larger. I can see the shape of every one of you and not one of your faces. He let that sit. I told nobody, because I was ashamed, and because a man who cannot read his own rent roll is at the mercy of the man who reads it to him. So, being too proud to be helped, I put 11,000 acres and all your livings into the hands of Mr. Ferriby, who has taken something above £500 out of this estate in 4 years, and who has gone. Now there was talk, a short rolling wave of it, and he stood and let it go until it stopped by itself. He was not found out by me. He was found out by a woman with 9 sheets of paper and a copy of every letter she ever wrote, who put the case together after I'd let her be served with notice to quit her own farm, and who took £90 out of her own totals because she could not prove them. His hand came off the table. Mrs. Craddock, will you come up here, please? The walk was about 40 feet. Agnes had crossed that barn 100 times at 100 harvests, and had never once been looked at while she did it, and she went up the middle of it, with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and Jem stayed where he was by the south door, because she had told him to, and because he could not have moved anyway. The Dowager Duchess of Havermere put a ring of keys into her nephew's hand, and he found the edge of the table with his knuckles, and turned and held them out. The counting-house, the strong room, the tenant's book, and the timber yard. Mrs. Agnes Craddock is steward of this estate from today, answerable to me and to no other person living. Her name goes in the book this afternoon at £120 a year, which is what I would have paid a man from Bristol with a good coat. He waited. Take them, or I shall have to go on standing here. She took them. They were heavier than she expected, which is the thing nobody tells you about keys, and the iron was warm from his hand. The clapping did not start at the top of the barn. It started at the south end, among the cottagers and the hop tenants and the men who were paid at the barn, and it came up the length of that building like water coming up a drain that has just been cleared. And somebody began beating on the trestle boards, and then everybody was. And the fiddle in the porch, having no better idea, began to play. Agnes stood with the keys in both hands and looked down the barn at her son, who had got up on a bench. She spoke to the tenants for 4 minutes, because there were things they needed to hear from her and not from him, and she said them in the order she had written down at 2 o'clock in the morning. 7-year leases. Rents fixed. The flood arrears struck on all 4 Cleve holdings, and the reason for it said out loud, twice, wages by name into the hand that cut. The office door opened on Tuesdays, and the ledger turned round on the desk so the tenant could see it every time without asking. That last one got the loudest noise of the day, which surprised the Dowager Duchess very much and did not surprise Agnes at all. They ate at 1, and the loaf was cut and handed down the tables in pieces the size of a thumb, which is the whole point of it, and the fiddle played until 4. Jem Craddock spent the afternoon holding a large raw-boned bay for anybody who asked him to, and several who did not, and by the end of it he had grown, by his mother's estimate, about an inch. In the evening, when the carts had gone, and the barn was down to a dozen men stacking trestles, Agnes walked home the long way, by the ridge and down along the Cleve, with the keys on a cord because she had nowhere else to put them. He was at the gate above the meadow with the lurcher. She was not surprised. She had known the shape of the day since Wednesday, and this was the part of it she had not let herself think about, on the sound principle that a woman who thinks about it in advance says it badly when it comes. The meadow below them lay in its second growth, dark and even, with the water going away down the new stone in a thin bright line you could hear if you stopped talking. Wynne went through the gate and lay down in the grass with a grunt, having no interest in either of them. Padmore got 3 cartloads of hay off that in June, Agnes remarked. 4. I have been steward of this estate for 6 days, and I know a great deal about hay. He had his arms on the top bar. 4 cartloads, and he is putting the top corner into Swedes because you told him to at the audit. And he told me so twice, both times as though it were his own idea, which I take to be the highest compliment available in this county. It is. They stood. Down in the fold a door shut, and the rooks were going home over the Havermere oaks in a long ragged thread. I am going to say this badly. The Duke of Havermere began, and I have had 4 days to prepare it. In about a year I shall not be able to see the shape of you against a window. In 5 I shall want a hand to cross a strange room. That is not a thing a man can offer a woman and call it an offer. He turned his head, in the way she knew, to bring her into the edge of what was left. So I shall put it to you as one careful person to another. I would like to marry you, and I have wanted to say so since the evening you refused £30 a year and asked me for a drain instead. Agnes did not answer at once. She was aware of the keys against her ribs, and of the sound of the water, and of a great tiredness that had been coming for a fortnight, and had chosen this exact minute to arrive. Which is your Grace asking? The steward or the woman? Both, and I know precisely how that sounds, and I want you to hear the rest before you decide what it means. His hand tightened on the bar. If you say no tonight, you are steward of this estate tomorrow and for the next 30 years, and I shall never raise it again. That is not a bargain. That is the arrangement, and it stands whichever way you answer. I am not offering you a farm to buy a wife. I did enough of that kind of arithmetic in May, and if I say yes, they will say I have gone up in the world. They will, for about 2 years. He shrugged one shoulder. Then there will be a bad winter, or a beast plague, and you will get 400 people through it, because you are the only person within 20 miles who can hold the whole of it in her head, and after that they will say her grace and mean the woman who dug the drain. I have thought about very little else. The water ran. It was the plainest sound in the world. Agnes Craddock took her hand off the gate and put it into his, and then, because she knew exactly what he could and could not do, she lifted it and held it up between them against the last of the western light, where the grey place was not, so that he would see it and not have to be told. He looked at it for a long moment. Yes, Agnes told him. For both. and I shall want it written into the settlement that the office door stands open on Tuesdays, because you are a duke, and I have learnt what you people are like about paper. They were married in the parish church on the last Saturday in October, with the Dowager Duchess in the front pew and Jem Craddock holding the ring in a fist he did not open until the last possible moment. The new estate ledger came from Hereford on the Tuesday after the wedding. It was bound in dark calf, and it had brass at the corners, and it had a strap, and the strap buckled. Agnes set it on the desk in the counting-house, in the room where the old desk had been taken out and burnt, and she squared it with the edge of the table out of habit, and she put the candle to her left so that the shadow of her hand would fall away from the page. Then she opened it and wrote the first line of the first column in a hand so small and even that the page looked ruled twice over, and turned the book round to face the door. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.